When Donald Trump was campaigning for his second tenure as the President of the United States, he called for tariffs amongst many major economies globally. He called for tariffs in China, Mexico, and Canada. These tariffs were import taxes, and he threatened to raise them anywhere from 10 to over 100%. The impacts of these had caused many negative effects globally. Stock markets dropped on the day he threatened to impose tariffs. Then other global leaders had also threatened to retaliate. But there's one country that is vital to the economic and future success of the United States. Yet Donald Trump has announced plans to impose massive tariffs on this country, and that is Taiwan. Trump has criticized major US companies like Apple, AMD, Broadcom, Nvidia, and Qualcomm for not building in the United States, but rather in Taiwan for their semiconductor facilities. Trump had threatened to impose tariffs so that these companies would possibly build their chips inside the US. But the problem here is that these tariffs are seen as setbacks. Tariffs are nothing but taxes on goods imported. When the United States buys semiconductor chips from Taiwan, they are mostly tariffs-free. But if Trump were to impose tariffs, semiconductor chips' cost could rise to as much as 100%. That doesn't only mean that semiconductors are going to be more expensive. It means that the cost of consumer electronics, automobiles, and countless other industries relying on advanced chips would also rise dramatically. That is one part of the economic impact to the United States. But before we actually dive deep into understanding the economic impacts, it is first important to understand the reason for Trump's tariffs threats. So let's begin with that. Taiwan is an important economy. It is home to the world's largest contract chip maker, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. Here's a graph on TSMC's market capitalization, which is basically a company's valuation. Here, you can see that TSMC's market cap is more than $1 trillion. What's stunning about this is the fact that Taiwan's economic output, or gross domestic product, GDP, isn't even $1 trillion. It sits at just $756 billion as of 2023. That means the entire market capitalization of Taiwan's biggest company is bigger than the annual economic output, or GDP, of Taiwan. But of course, this isn't really a reliable comparison. What may have been reliable is to compare TSMC to the world's largest companies. Here's a list for that. Data, as of the time of writing. Here you can see that TSMC is the 9th largest company globally. That easily puts them above major US companies like Berkshire Hathaway, Walmart, JP Morgan Chase, and a long list of other businesses. Now, the reason why TSMC is such a huge corporation is no other than semiconductors. TSMC has various semiconductor plants across Taiwan. They have some in Taichung, some in Tainan, in Kaohsiung, and so on. These plants produce a wide variety of semiconductor chips for companies like Apple and Nvidia. That is what makes them valuable. But that's also what Trump dislikes. It's the fact that these facilities are being manufactured in Taiwan and not inside the United States. That is why he has criticized many American firms for sourcing or building their factories outside of the US and not inside it. The effects felt by the United States does not only lie in the fact that it may lose their ability to manufacture locally, but in what we call as trade balance. Trade balance is the difference between the value of a country's exports and its imports. A country that exports more than it imports has a trade surplus, while a country that imports more than it exports has a trade deficit. For decades, the US has run a trade deficit with many major economies, and one of them is Taiwan. Here's a graph on the US-Taiwan trade in goods data from the US Census Bureau. Here you can see that the US exports a lot of goods to Taiwan. But at the same time, it also imports goods from the country. In fact, as denoted by the line, they actually import more from Taiwan than they export. That results in a trade deficit. For 2024, that goods deficit is a massive $67.4 billion. That means Taiwan would receive over $67.4 billion in trade surplus with the United States. That money then goes into the pockets of Taiwan, which could be registered in their foreign reserves, or be used to buy other goods from other countries. That is one of the reasons for Taiwan's strong economic performance. It's the fact that the US buys or imports so many goods from Taiwan. And this trade deficit is what Trump hates. He wants to decrease this deficit. That is because in Trump's view, this deficit is a reflection of American manufacturing failure and trade policies. A failure that tariffs, in his estimation, can remedy by forcing both US companies and their international suppliers to reconsider where and how their goods are produced. That is the second reason behind Trump's tariffs. He wants to create a financial incentive for major tech companies like Apple, AMD, Broadcom, Nvidia, and Qualcomm to invest in domestic chip fabrication facilities. In his own words, the tariffs would serve as a tax on those who stole our chip business, pressuring them to build plants on American soil where production costs, though higher, would eventually contribute to reducing the trade deficit. Fortunately, the previous presidency of Joe Biden has tried to fix this with his own policies. Biden had enacted the CHIPS Act, which aimed to not only restore US manufacturing leadership in semiconductor production, but also to catalyze domestic investments in advanced chip fabrication, research and development, and workforce training. Here's a list of new chip fabrication facilities that are coming to the United States. A lot of these fabs had broken ground under Biden's tenure. Here's another graph on the grants given by companies by the CHIPS Act. Here you can see that the companies that were given are a mix of American companies and foreign ones, Taiwan and South Korea. But this is particularly important because TSMC is the leading semiconductor firm globally, and they are now developing a new plant in the US. Unfortunately, Trump actually argued against the CHIPS Act, stating that it was unnecessary and counterproductive. He claimed that private companies, such as Intel, should use their own resources to build fabs and not rely on public funding. Whether he is right or wrong about that matter, however, will be for another video. Now, as you can see, these reasons are what led Trump to impose tariffs on other foreign countries, and potentially Taiwan. But let's now talk about the potential economic impact. Well, it's hard to quantify the impact, since it hasn't been done yet. There's also limited studies done for Taiwan on this matter. So the best we can do is to see it from the perspective of other nations. Let's use a study published by the tax foundation General Equilibrium Model. Here's a table on the estimated impact of President Trump's proposed tariffs. There are two scenarios here, and as you can see, if scenario 1 were to be done, over 1.1 million full-time equivalent employment could be lost. GDP would also be affected by minus 1.3%. Here's another table on the trade war tariff collections annually per household, data from the same source. Here you can see that since 2018, the collections have increased. But if Trump were to impose higher tariffs, this could likewise go higher than where it is today. But what's concerning about Trump's tariffs on Taiwan is what we mentioned earlier. Taiwan is an important economic ally to the United States. They are vital to the electronics, automobiles, and nearly all aspects of the US economy. If Trump were to impose tariffs on Taiwan, it would likely be felt more in the United States and less in Taiwan. Why? Because even if semiconductor imports would become more expensive, the US would still buy them, at least in the short term. That is because they need these advanced chips. And those advanced chips can't be replicated overnight. Megafabs that are capable of producing the most advanced chips aren't going to be built in months, but years, or even potentially decades if it wants to catch up to Taiwan. Here's a graph on the Taiwanese exports to the United States for the year 2022, data from the Observatory of Economic Complexity. Here you can see that two categories dominate the exports. These then showcase that they really need Taiwan only for one thing: semiconductors. Now, before we end the video, it is also possible to say that these tariffs may not really be implemented at all. Why? Because Trump actually once threatened to impose 60% on Chinese goods. But instead, according to the latest reports, it's only just 10%. This goes to show that even if he wanted to impose tariffs, he actually can't, because the United States still needs cheap goods. Therefore, while tariffs can harm Taiwan and the US, the likelihood of it happening is very, very low. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.